Can we start off by you telling me what is the difference between a systemic problem and a regular problem?
So, say, for example, you're looking at the best way to do your bookkeeping. It's probably not the best idea in the world to be super innovative when it comes to how you do your bookkeeping, right? Like, bookkeeping is something you want to stay within the parameters of what is legal, of what is considered good or best practice. And you want to make sure to solve this problem of bookkeeping as simply as possible, right? You will try to make it as straightforward and as useful as possible for anyone who does need the results of your bookkeeping process. And usually you can have a pretty linear relationship between I will sit down to do this bookkeeping using this template or using this software and the output that comes at the end of it, right? Like, it's pretty predictable. You can plan it, you can control it, you can get trained for it, get a degree in that. So that could be considered a problem that, depending on the size, of course, of the organization you're looking at, but in general, it's a problem that is considered simple according to the Kinefin model. So a model that helps us understand what kind of setting are we operating in and then adjusting the way in which we act based on that. Now, if I said, hey, Mike, let's try to fly a rocket to Mars, now that would be a complicated problem, right? That would be something that requires a lot of expert knowledge, typically many different kinds of expertise that really needs to come together to solve this particular problem. And we will maybe, based on all of that expertise, put together a prototype. We will try it. It may work, it may fail, right? And arguably, there might be people who disagree in how to best solve it, right? Some people may say, I have an idea for a rocket that's completely different and it's very innovative. And there's potential value if you're interested in getting to Mars, which I am not personally, but for the sake of this example, you could get together and explore a new way of doing that, right? So that is a complicated problem. So there is not a guaranteed relationship between what you do and the result, because there are some unknowns and you need to figure some things out. But as long as the science is sound and you do the work of bringing the expertise together, usually you can replicate it, right? You can say, we built a rocket once this time. If we build it again in this way again, then probably we will have the same result at the launch. Now, a complex issue is an issue where none of these rules apply, where you may intervene once and get a different result. You may intervene again in the same time, just, a month later or a year later, and get a completely different result. You do not have this relationship between cause and the action that caused the result. It's much more complex than that, right? Hence the sense of complexity. And the problem typically arises when we are in a complex context. For example, take a natural ecosystem. Very complex, right? And we have some science and some knowledge around how a certain ecosystem, say a forest, works, but we keep learning more, right? And we keep discovering how limited the human view actually is, right? We were like, oh, a forest, yeah, it's a bunch of trees, they stand next to each other. And now we're learning that they communicate with each other, right? That there's mycelial network underneath the earth that we don't see, that are very important for sharing resources and information amongst the trees, etc. So this just goes to show that usually our view on something that is complex is by definition always limited. And there's an example actually from your home country, if you don't mind me picking on you for a sec. You must be familiar with the Aga Toad.
No.
It's this massive toad that has, like, kind of colonized a large chunk of the Australian island. And it happened because last century there was a beetle plague that was eating the sugarcane, and sugarcane was a very important industry.
In English, it's called a cane toad.
There you go. That's the one.
Okay.
So we call it the Aga Toad. And I mention this example often when I have a speech or something like that, right? So they're like, okay, beetle cane, a problem with this beetle that eats our sugarcane. Great idea. Toad will eat beetle, right? Except toad did not eat beetle. And not only did it not eat the beetle, like, it had no natural predators, right, across the whole continent, and it just spread. And not only does it not have any natural predators, but it's actually so toxic, poisonous, that if a predator, local one, were to eat it, it would most likely die from doing so, right? So now it's kind of this slow overtaking of the continent that happens due to someone that had a linear thought process, right? Like, they thought, oh, this is the problem, let me solve it in this way. But they didn't account for the complexity of the ecosystem, and nor did they do any testing, to be fair. It could have been something that would be a bit easier avoided. So yeah, so that is the difference between a challenge that is complex or systemic, could be another way that we use for it, and a challenge that is complicated versus a challenge that is simple or straightforward.
So could you say it'd be a combination of number of variables and level of knowledge required to solve it?
Yes, that could be one way to look at it, but there's a number of different ways to approach the question. So, for example, there are people who say that a complex challenge, whenever you think you've solved the challenge, you actually have just revealed the deeper challenge, right? So you try to address the problem, but then the deeper root cause reveals itself, and then you have to go after that. Another kind of definition that people use is that complex challenges, the moment you've intervened, you've also changed the system. You've already had an impact, whether it was what you wanted or not, whether you've solved the challenge or not, you already had an impact just by you intervening. Whereas like if I'm doing my bookkeeping and I don't publish it, I just do something on my computer, like that's not going to have consequences for anyone else. Whereas if the complex challenge is, for example, migration or racism or inclusion or women's rights, right? The moment I intervene as me, even with the best of intentions, I will do something to the system, right? That is going to have a ripple effect, most likely something that I am unable to predict. Other people say that complex challenges, in essence, can never be completely resolved. They can be differently negotiated, right? Like we may look at this and as a society or as a group of people say, this used to be normal. We don't think this should be normal anymore, right? Like you can say women not having the right to vote. You can say slavery, right? You can name any sorts of examples. Nowadays, maybe it's throwaway culture and plastic, right? Where collectively we kind of were like, oh yeah, that's pretty normal that I just buy something, it's wrapped in plastic and then I throw it out. And maybe 100 years from now, people were like, our ancestors were insane, right? Because it's not normal anymore. So the view that we have on challenges, especially if they're systemic challenges, is very normative, right? It's based on the values that we hold. So that's another way that you could look at it. So yeah, it's a big field.
It's interesting. It reminds me, I remember I read this great book called The Body, and it's a great book. And eventually it talks about how in I guess it would have been the late 50s, how smoking was a regular thing, and doctors would say, yeah, this is fine, this is totally healthy, and it wasn't perceived as a problem. And now in hindsight, we look back and it's like, that's the stupidest thing ever. How could you possibly think that's a good idea? I do wonder in 50 years' time what people are going to see saying about 2020 something. How stupid were those guys doing those things then? How could you possibly think that drinking out of water bottles is a good idea?
For sure. Yeah. And the sad thing is that we can often trace back some of these things to who really benefited from them, right? And who architected it. Because some kind of, disasters or, I would say, let me do a retake. Because some disasters or problematic situations are like a result of circumstances, right? There's a storm, there's a frost, there's a drought, something is out of our control and it just happens and we have to kind of deal with it. But for example, the plastic issue that we have was completely engineered, right? In the sense that there were industry players that saw, if we move away from the completely circular, by the way, model of glass, right? We would make such a bigger profit margin. We could get our products to places where we can't get them yet, right? So let's just push for that. And then meetings were had where people were like, but don't you think that like the average consumer is going to mind like just throwing away, right, a bottle after using it? And they were like, we're going to call it recycling, right? So like you can actually kind of trace back some of these developments to knowingly very much specifically implement something so as for something to be normalized, right? And if you look at climate change, for example, too, we know that the biggest polluters, we know that the petrol industry have known for decades, right, about global warming and about the consequences. And they have specifically decided not just to not do anything, right, but like to infiltrate climate negotiations and to put out propaganda to confuse and muddy the waters so we will be slower to react. So sometimes when people look at humans and are like, oh, are we just a parasite? Are we so terrible? Are we so short-sighted? I'm like, well, sometimes we are, and we need to face that. And in many other cases, you can trace the problem back to a handful of people who saw that there was bank to be made, right? That had big private interests in keeping us uninformed or misinformed.
Would you look at, I've heard this, I agree with you to a sense, but I also want to also attempt to give people the benefit of the doubt? Like, could you also say that plastic is one of the, or single-use plastic is one of the 20th century's biggest and best innovations, because it allowed the whole world to be able to, it's a great tool, it is cheap, it is quick to make, you can use it for a million different things. And at the time of creation, the world did not have the knowledge it has today in the impact it has. And so small companies, small businesses, or even big ones thinking this is going to be a great product. Yes, it's going to make us a lot of money, but it's also because it's a great product. And they're thinking of, yeah, I don't care about how this destroys the world, isn't really part of their thinking. That is just something we see in retrospect.
In some cases, yes. I mean, what I specifically said is not that these people knowingly went on to destroy the world and like poison us all, right? In the petrol industry, we know that this is the case. In the plastics industry, I agree that, unforeseen consequences like, whoops, microplastics everywhere, et cetera, maybe could we have seen it coming? Maybe not. That's kind of debatable. But what I said is that they came up with the concept of throwaway culture. That's what they invented, right? Like, couldn't we kind of convince people that it's okay to just throw away things? And I, rather than kind of, when I say this, I'm not coming at it from a place of like, what horrible people, they are so evil and mean, and like this kind of monopoly, Picsou figure who just tries to harness all the resources from themselves. Maybe some are like that. But my main point is that these people are embedded in a certain paradigm of thought, as we are all, right? So we are socialized into certain paradigms. We are told, here's how the world works. Here's how the economy works. Here's how, women should behave. Here's how men should behave. Here's how, like, all these categorizations that we are given, right? The story of what it means to be a human being, and maybe even a good human being, what success means, right? What a society does, like all those things are teachings that we receive from our parents, from our peers, from schools, from the media, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all profoundly embedded paradigms. Like the patriarchy is an embedded paradigm. Capitalism is an embedded paradigm. Colonialism is another embedded paradigm. And we are socialized into these without us knowing. It's like the fish that's in the water. We are just in the water. We don't know that it could be any different. This is just the environment that we have. And then only if we, for example, learn about other cultures where they had 7 genders, we're like, what? 7 genders? Like, we were always told, right? Like, there's 2 and that's that, and no discussion. Or a completely different view on humanity and what it means to be human. Or a philosophy, for example, coming from Brazil and like a feminist movement there that's about, well, good living, bem viver. And that's a life philosophy. And I'm like, wow, like that's very different from the philosophies that we receive here. And so in that sense, when I, look upon people who have made decisions that have had disastrous consequences for all of us, I do not want to kind of point a finger blankly and say that all of them did this knowingly and with like just the intention of looking away from the consequences and for their own benefit. Because maybe if I had been that person, if I had received all of the same teachings and conditioning, maybe the same decision would have seemed logical to me. Right? So I think the conversation around what paradigms are we coming from? What opinion do I have about nature? Do I see myself as part of nature? Or do I see myself as separate? And therefore, if I'm separate, well, it's okay to extract resources and maybe destroy a couple of things, right? So all of these things subconsciously influence us so much. So I hold a lot of empathy, right? So we need to kind of call it out when it does happen, like has been revealed with the petrol industry. And at the same time, who am I to say that if I would, for example, be socialized into a long line of petrol barons, that I wouldn't act in the exact same way?
Yeah, it's a good, well said. I also think petrol's an interesting one, again, because could you also make the argument, and I don't want to suggest anything, like I don't have an opinion about this, I really don't, I'm just exploring ideas, but could you also make the argument that pulling petrol out of the ground is a necessary evil because of the way it fuels the world in terms of energy, and the energy that the fossil fuels has created is a net positive due to the explosion of all the different innovations and growth and development, and taking us out of the what was the age before the, I don't know, combustion engine. But regardless, I wonder if I was the CEO of Shell, and someone said, hey, the fossil fuel industry is evil, would he say, yes, I agree with you, but it's a necessary evil? Or would he have or if he's being honest, mind you, not if he's giving talk to shareholders, or would he have a different answer? I'm trying to, to understand both sides as much as possible, I guess.
Yeah. So from my point of view, I'm less interested in the history and what should we have done maybe at the time and da, 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 da. I think we can learn some things when we look back, for sure, right? And we should, because otherwise we're going to keep repeating history. But my focus is kind of now that we do know for certain, and we are really, really sure about this, and we've known for a while, right, collectively, what we should do, and the opportunities are here and the technology is here, right? It's not like there is such a massive gap that kind of we have no idea how to fill, et cetera, et cetera. So now that we are where we are and we know the consequences for all of us, but especially people who live, for example, on islands that are going to disappear, right, in a couple of years, a couple of decades. Even just the other day, I saw a region in the UK where people are now climate migrants, refugees, because they live next to the seaside shore and they knew, this is going to be, swallowed by the ocean in a couple of years. So they're starting to move away. Anyway, so this is a very real thing, right? This is not a hypothetical. And I'm not a climate scientist, but with, breakdown of our food system, etc., this is really existential. So it's not anymore would it be nice if we maybe reduced a little bit the CO2 footprint? It's really a matter of are we interested in surviving as a species? And are we interested in surviving in a way that is actually a good life, right? Because I don't think that all of us just living in a bunker, those who can afford it for the rest of our lives and being in virtual reality is necessarily a good life. So what is a good life? What does that mean for us? And can we work towards that? So now that we're in this particular place, what can we do and why are we not doing it, right? So this is where the complexity piece comes in and the fact that this is a systemic issue because it affects us all and the status quo benefits a small set of people, right? Very, very much the people who are financially very invested in this industry and are reaping great benefits, but also all of us who are quote unquote part of the global north, right? Part of the global 1%, let's say, or 10%, and are really reaping the benefits of this lifestyle, right? That we have in a way, unfortunately, partially unknowingly, built off the backs of other people, right? Who are remaining in other situations. So this is kind of the context that we are in. And then indeed, if we are now approaching, for example, someone who is a CEO in a petrol company, and we just say, oh, your industry is evil, that will be pretty much impossible for this person to hear. So either they know, and they're if they would be honest, they would be right, I don't care what you think. I'm just following my script. I'm just doing what I was told success is, et cetera, et cetera. Or they may really not know and not be able to see it because they are so invested in it, right? So I learned in my studies in one paper, I quote this everywhere, that resistance to change correlates with investment in the status quo. So what this means is I'm very invested in the way things are, either financially, it brings me a lot of financial return. My infrastructure, right? We have a whole infrastructure for cars, for example, makes it harder to switch over to bikes or public transport. But it could also be my identity. If my whole identity is wrapped up in this construct, right? In this industry, and I worked myself to the top of it, et cetera, I'm carrying on a family legacy. There's so much in that psychologically. For someone to come and have a critical point of view, the chance that I'm able to hear that is fairly slim. And we don't have to take the oil baron as an extreme example to, make that clear. It can also be as a white person. If someone confronts me, for example, if I said something that was a microaggression or a racist microaggression, or if someone points out to me that I'm using terms that are ableist, and I don't know this because I'm mostly an able-bodied person, or I say something that's fatphobic and I don't realize. If I'm very invested in, for example, being a good person, it will be very hard for me to hear that feedback. Because my whole psychology, my whole defense reaction will be but no, I'm a good person, right? I'm not a racist. I'm not these things. And that kind of creates this smokes and mirrors reaction that makes it impossible for the actual information and the feedback to really land with me on an emotional level. So yeah, it's very human. It's, something we all do in some way, shape, or form.
Some of these bigger systemic problems I can understand, and also similar to what you just said, why they're difficult to solve, because some people may not even accept they're real. And if you've never swum in the ocean before, and you might go, it looks fine to me, I don't see any plastic, this is not a real problem. That's a weird example, but just take that as an example. I can understand in some circumstances, some of these problems, you could be in denial that it's a problem. Other ones, there is no possible way any human on Earth could agree that we shouldn't get rid of world poverty, because everyone can imagine what life is like being extremely poor, and you can get pretty good evidence to show that a large population is in poverty. So I guess for a lot of, and that's just one extreme example, but I guess there's lots of them where you go, the general population, that's, who knows, 99% of the population go, yeah, this is a problem. And yet these problems don't seem to go away, or even, and correct me if I'm wrong, they don't seem to be getting better. They seem to be getting worse. And I hope that's not true. That's just my perception. Why does that seem to be the case?
Mm-hmm. On one level, things are accelerating now and seemingly getting worse because we are still accelerating ecosystem collapse and global warming, even though we are already seeing its impacts, right? So this was, for example, astonishing to me. Like, as a Swiss person, a couple of years ago, we had floods in the summer, right? And it was super clear that this was like linked to climate change, and people died just in Germany, right? Like, I think 60 people died in Germany when a river kind of overflew. And I was like, it's here. Like, now we're going to get it. And then nothing happened. Or like recently, the village of Blatten, right, was swept away or buried under a glacier that came down. And I'm like, surely now, as a collective, we understand, right? Because the hypothesis is always like climate change is hard to tackle because the consequences always seem so far away. They seem to concern someone else, somewhere else, in the future, or in another country, right? In another part of the world. It doesn't affect us. And so if I were to put my hand in the fire and I would feel the pain of being burned, I probably wouldn't put my hand in the fire again, right? But if every time I put my hand in the fire, someone else far away gets burned, or a couple of decades in the future, someone gets burned, some people are like, oh, either we are not told, we are not aware, we are not informed, or we are so steeped in the narratives that we were socialized into that we are somehow just, thinking, oh, that's normal, or that's just how things are, or somehow it's interesting that you brought this example, that you think that, for example, for world poverty, people want to resolve the problem, right? In my experience, as soon as the challenge is social, like, for example, poverty, for example, women's rights, for example, racism, many people actually, because of how we were socialized into this narrative of like, it's a little bit the American dream applied to us, like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, if you work hard enough, you can make it, right? Like, that's kind of like what we are told. Like, in this society, if you work hard, you can make it. And there is a meritocracy. Of course, as soon as you study, right, as soon as you look into the science a little bit, you see that that's not fully true. If both of your parents, for example, know how to read, that will set you up for success in life much more than if they don't, right? Like, your gender impacts it, your skin color impacts it. There's so many things that impact actually your trajectory on life. So, someone could try twice as hard as I'm trying, and just because I happen to be born in Switzerland, that my skin is white, etc., I may achieve things or have opportunities that they never have. And that's really hard to face and to accept, right? But what I'm saying here is that because we are told this narrative and we are given all sorts of strange stories, and I would even in some cases call it brainwashing of other countries and other places, that for some people, if they look at poverty, they just think people are poor out of choice. Like, they just think, well, they should just work a little harder. Right?
I see.
And so that's where, like, we need to uncover the system and how the system works, and kind of the results that are systematically created by this system. I'm overusing the term, but you get my point. Because we tend to collectively overemphasize the individual responsibility, right? Like, if I win at something, I tend to think, oh, well, it's because of me. If someone doesn't succeed at something, I may think it's because of them. And partially our own effort, of course, plays a role, right? So this is not to say that I got everything handed to me or that you did or whoever did and others are not. Like, they are always outliers, exceptions, and we all put in effort. But to kind of understand that other people are kept in poverty almost by design, and as a result of something that I participate in, that's really hard to face, right? Like, even just the technology that we're talking on. I mean, I buy my tech secondhand, which is still not a perfect solution because someone had to buy it new for me to get it secondhand. But yeah, the minds, the kids and the people who are suffering and are kept in these circumstances so that we can do our work in this case, right? And raise awareness. And so it's not all bad, but it can be hard to, as an individual, connect to like the footprint of pain almost. So rather than the CO2 footprint, which I think is also interesting and important, really connecting to the footprint of pain, like, who made my clothes, who made my tech, where did my food come from? How did this animal, if I'm eating an animal, feel as it was killed before it landed on my plate? Like, if you really, really open yourself up to the pain of other people, of animals, of nature, that are a result of what we are told is a normal way to live, right? It's normal to order something and get it tomorrow. That's hard to do because you don't need to be the oil baron, right? You can just be a participant in a system you were taught. You can just be a participant in a system you were taught this is normal. There is no problem with any of this.
Mm. So if you do see a lot of systemic problems, such as, take your pick, one of the many being impacted by global warming, plastics in the ocean, global conflict, and you see them all, they all bother you, you want to do something about it. It's an overwhelming amount, not only because there seems to be so many problems, but also it's in your face every single day in a never-ending feed, right? And what the natural reaction is, I don't like this, I want to do something about it. But what is the individual supposed to even do other than grab a sign, write something on it, go onto the street and start screaming, I want this to stop? What do you I would like to walk through with you, that's okay now, in terms of like starting from what I just described as a person fed up and wanting to do something, but also what steps should I take that result in the most useful and productive output?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big question because there, as you say, there are so many challenges. And yeah, I always think of this poem by Barson Shire. She says, or she wrote, and later that night, I open the atlas on my lap. I run my hand across the page and I ask, where does it hurt? And it says, everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And it's true, right? Like, the challenges and the pain and the issues are truly everywhere. There's also beauty and joy in many places, and it's important that we make space for that. But so if I'm faced with all of those challenges and I want to find what is mine to do, what is mine to contribute, I think there's, to me, kind of two key pieces to this. One is to understand that I am a part of the system, right? So rather than go, oh, this system is so terrible and someone should change it, and kind of cross my arms and think, I'm going to vote next time for another politician who will change it, or whatever the case may be, right? Kind of taking myself out of it and thinking that the system is other people somewhere else who need to do something. There's a lot that we can do by just understanding all the ways in which we are the system, in the sense that we contribute to perpetuating paradigms and co-creating results that we actually don't want, right? And that can be hard to do because it means confronting our own habits, behavior, maybe something we've been doing for years, to kind of acknowledge, okay, actually, maybe that's not great and I want to change. So the key here for me is to not fall into the trap of perfectionism, like not have this idea that like, okay, either I'm going to be a model, human being starting tomorrow, perfect on all fronts, sustainability, social equity, everything, or I'm not even going to try. Like, that is such a dangerous thing, right? And I know that sometimes in this movement, and also from people who are on the sidelines of the movement, criticism is so vicious and harsh, right? Like, you can have the most outspoken climate activist who's, really dedicating their life to this cause and doing, everything that they can. And then once they make a trade-off and they fly to a climate negotiation, for example, the outcry, right?
Mhm.
And like, I often imagine people in the comments, like they're literally like screaming whilst having like their sausage in the hand and, like so angry, but like without being able to take a look at themselves, right?
Mm,
So that's
sure.
always interesting to me. Like, how much energy do we spend criticizing other people for what they're doing or not doing? And how much energy am I spending on myself, figuring out what I can do? So that's a general prompt, like figure out what is it that I can tackle, that I can change. And this will be different for every single person, right? For example, for me to stop eating meat was very easy because I never liked meat. I never wanted it. As soon as I could tell it had been an animal, I just instinctively didn't want to eat it. So for me, not a big deal. For other people, maybe culturally or in their family or taste-wise, it was a huge deal. So much harder to reduce their meat intake, for example. For me, clothes were so hard because I had low self-esteem. I really bought into all of this propaganda, right? That I was never pretty enough, never good enough. And if only I would buy this new shiny thing, then maybe, right? So I did a lot of retail therapy and kind of trying to cope with that insecurity through buying clothes. So for me to stop shopping, that was horrible. Or, to buy less in general,
Mm,
right? And kind of be more mindful about that. So just as a personal example to say that like we are all different and some things will come easy to us, other things won't. And hopefully we can kind of also help each other out in this, right? Maybe you have a friend who's like super excited about, I don't know, fixing clothes and knitting and stitching and stuff. Great. If you have holes in your socks, rather than throw them out, you can go to this person. And maybe you're like into, I don't know, fermentation of foods and making kimchi and whatnot, or sauerkraut. And maybe you can help your friend out to do that, right? So also let's remind ourselves that we are a collective, right? That we are not alone in this process, that we can actually support and inspire each other. So I think that's another kind of key part. And then we can just take it step by step. Again, not falling into the trap of perfectionism, but kind of thinking, what could be my project this month? Maybe my project this month, because it's Veganuary is coming up in January, I'm going to participate in that. Or maybe my project is reading this book about racism and facing that. Or maybe my project is looking at tech and where my tech is coming from, etc. Right? So we can kind of take it step by step to align our own behavior more and more with our true values and our intention and the kind of future that we wish to have. What's also important in this is to not, in my opinion, come at it from like a punitive place or like a place of lack and, right, like, oh, I have to, in German we say verzicht, like I have to renounce this, right? Almost like, I don't know, you're dieting and you don't want to eat the cake and, oh, that's so sad to give up the cake. Actually, when we start to transform our life in this way, we can find so much joy and happiness and belonging, connection to community. So that's something I want to challenge, right? That the roads to aligning our behavior with our values is not one of just renouncing and sacrificing one thing after the other. It can be one of joy, expansion, and really kind of finding your inner home as well as your home with other people. So that's the whole part around like your own behavior that I would say is important, right? Because we are all, like I said, part of the system. And then the second part is to find what I call your unique contribution. So this is my personal life philosophy that I think we are all here in this time because we have gifts to contribute that will help us navigate what we're currently facing. I do believe everyone has what I call a unique contribution. And for some people, this may not be in their work life. For some people, this may be in their family life. This may be in how they show up as a neighbor. It can be all sorts of things. But my focus is on people that do focus their work on that, right? So they look for their unique contribution in terms of their work. My day, right? My work time, where can I invest it to make the biggest possible difference, right? And that goes, I think, to your question of like, how do I prioritize if all these issues are important? And so I developed this framework called the SEED framework. It stands for self-awareness, envisioning, ecosystem awareness, and then designing. And so the point here is that I think to find your unique contribution, it's really important to know yourself well, right? Who am I? What are my values? What are my gifts, my strengths, right? What are the things that I can build on and bring into whatever it ends up being that I will do? It's really important also that we connect to the vision, not just fight against what's going wrong now, but really, what are we working towards? Why are we doing this? Like, what would this good life be that we aspire to and that we hope all human beings can have across the planet, right? So like that vision, that envisioning part is often missed as a step or ignored or discredited, but I think it's really important. And then ecosystem awareness means meeting the world where it's at and developing a sense of awareness of what is happening in that ecosystem. So we go through a process of looking from the causes that I really, care about or that kind of stand out to me, what is actually going on. And then with systems thinking, you have a number of different tools that you can apply to like sharpen your understanding of that. So you can really see, for example, if I really care about, say, food waste or the food system in general in my city, in my context, I can begin to have a look, what's really going on? Who's making the decisions, right? Who's benefiting from the status quo? Who's underserved in the status quo? Who is trying to address this challenge already and in what ways? And all of that information will then allow me to design my strategy, my role, and my next step. So basically combining this information of knowing myself really well and knowing the system, the context in which I want to contribute as well as possible. And I have a little process, which we can maybe put in the show notes for your listeners as a little freebie, but I have like a flow chart that helps you anchor your cause, like make it, let's say this again, that helps you anchor your cause at a level at which you can actually address it. Because many people, when they see these massive issues and the global injustice, etc., they think very high level. They suddenly go super meta. They're like, okay, how do we reform capitalism? Or how do we stop climate change on a global level, right? And I often have to encourage people, focus on what is actionable for you. Where is your sphere of influence? Where can you really make a difference? And maybe that's in your company, maybe that's in your city, in your neighborhood, right? It can be all sorts of places. For some people, it's national or beyond. But I am much more interested in people who are driving profound change at small scale than people who keep just talking in theory about what we should do on a global level, right? Which we can be doing for the next 10 years, and we are not going to see any change. So yeah, I really want to encourage people to kind of, if they feel called to really make their unique contribution and want to drive transformation, to find where they are really, really well positioned to make a difference right now. Because I believe there is that gift.
If we take your example of the vicious cycle, which is fast fashion, and we say, okay, yep, I agree, I am going to be very responsible with how and where I buy my clothes from, but it's not enough. This is the thing that I'm personally attached to. This is where I want to spend my energy. Could we maybe you could choose a different example, but could we walk through what a practical step-by-step would look like for someone living in Switzerland to actually go to provide valuable contribution to a particular systemic problem like fast fashion?
For sure. So for example, if I'm really, really committed to this issue of fast fashion, I would still do the step of self-awareness. So I would identify my values, my strengths, my skills that I can really bring to the table, my passions, because sometimes there's, things that we don't think of as professional, but they're actually a great tool for change. Like, for example, maybe I'm really passionate about making music and I write songs. Well, you could write the next hit, that is speaking to this issue. Who knows, right? So also be open-minded about what constitutes a contribution. So that's why I include passions. And causes, we already got that covered. It's going to be fast fashion, right, as an issue. And then we move to the next step of envisioning. Well, like, what would a future in which this is solved look like, right? What is the alternative? What is the more beautiful future, the more regenerative and just future that you're really aiming for? Why are you doing this, right? What's driving it? And from there, we would go into better understanding the system in itself. So we would have a look, how does this system work? Who are the players, right? And pretty quickly, you would find, for example, the big global retail chains, right? Like H&M and Zara, et cetera, et cetera. You would probably find that there are, factories in different countries that are maybe subsidiaries or that are independent, right? Like it gets a little bit out of my expertise how this actually works. But if this person is very expert in this, they will know exactly what I'm talking about. We have regulators, right? So then the question is like, who's making these rules? Is it like the World Trade Organization? Is it some kind of EU regulation? Are there standards that need to be respected? If yes, who decides those standards? Are any labels relevant that we want to consider, right? Like Oecotex or organic, et cetera, et cetera. And we will really try to kind of map out that system. I have a template for that, which I'm also happy to put in the show notes, to kind of better understand the mechanics of the system. And the reason why we do that is to not just jump in at the first thing that we think is a problem, right? So typically, and an easy example here is plastic in the ocean. People are like, oh, plastic in the ocean, let me do a beach cleanup, because that's what you see. You see the plastic that's lying on the beach, right? That's an obvious issue. But it does take some more thinking, reflection, and preparation to move away from single-use plastics entirely, which would be effectively resolving the problem, right? The beach cleanup doesn't long-term resolve the problem. So in the same way, in the textile industry, we would try to look at how is this system actually put together? What are the most problematic signals, right? Like, for example, you've probably seen these massive mountains of clothes that are just dumped in different countries on the African continent for the most part, right? Way more than they could possibly handle or absorb, etc. And we are told these are donations, right? So you would kind of uncover like all of these places. You would uncover the places where factories violate human rights. You would uncover the rivers that are polluted. You would uncover the resources used for this, right? You would uncover all of that. And you would also uncover who decides, so who makes the rules, and who really benefits currently in this situation. So who is kind of invested, as per what we were discussing before, into this not changing, right? Because we could ban fast fashion. We could say, if you're a fashion brand, you can do 2 seasons a year tops. That could potentially be a law that we make, right? So who is very interested in this law never, ever, ever happening? And you will find, right, Shine, you will find all of these kind of drop shipping and H&M, etc. So you would do that analysis. And then, really importantly, you would bring it to a context that is actionable for you. So say I'm a person based in Switzerland, unless I happen to be some kind of very visible thought leader that has maybe European influence or global influence, unless I'm elected in the, I don't know, European Parliament or in the UN or some kind of institution, most likely it will make sense to zoom in a little bit, right? Like to scale down my thinking to, say, the Swiss context as a specific focus, or maybe even my city, potentially, depending on the case. And there it already depends, right? Do I live in St. Gallen, which has a history with the textile industry, right? That slowly left Switzerland, but some essence of it is still there. Am I in Zurich, which is like, you know, has this startup environment, many like brocheries and secondhand shops and this kind of, right, like there's a scene there of things already happening. Am I in Appenzell, where like no one maybe is thinking about this, or actually some local person is, right, etc. So my context becomes really important. And then I would try to narrow it down to that sphere where I can actually make a difference. So my city, my neighborhood, maybe the country. And then from there, I would think, knowing that this is now my system, so say it's my city, I would go through this mapping process again. I would say, okay, what H&M does in Bangladesh, outside of my sphere of influence, what, you know, this institution at the European level does outside of my sphere of influence. But how do the people in Zurich consume within my sphere of influence? How are secondhand shops organized in Zurich? Potentially within my sphere of influence. What rules exist in Zurich, right? Do we have any laws? For example, there was just a success recently to ban advertising in Zurich as a measure to try to stop encouraging people to overconsume systemically, right? So I would kind of see like, okay, what really exists specifically in my context in Zurich? Who's already trying to solve this issue, right? Like how many associations already exist? How many thought leaders, how many politicians regularly speak about this in the Zurich Parliament, et cetera, et cetera. And from that mapping, I would begin to see potential intervention points. So I would maybe see, over in Paris, they put a law that we don't have yet. How about I work with these stakeholders to push for this particular law to come to Zurich? Or I could say, I really see that the secondhand stores are all really struggling. And I think there's an opportunity here. And maybe if you're a business type person, you may do a social enterprise around that, like Rework, right? For those who know it. If you're an academic, you may say, let me help my students study the challenge and come up with little projects around it, right? So depending again on who you are and what your skills are, what you end up doing will be very individual. And that's important. So I think it's really important that we consider both what does the system need, like what's the problem, and what am I really well positioned to do? Because if I set myself on a path, kind of forcing myself to do something because I think it's the most important thing to do, most likely I will end up in a burnout. right? So it's important that it's a path that also nourishes me back as much as possible.
It does sound like, really, for you to be able to tackle this problem in the best way you can, you have to become an expert in the problem. And it sounds like your approach is a framework to become an expert, because it's an overwhelming amount of things which you have to learn. And it sounds like these are the steps you take to becoming that expert. Would that be a fair way to summarize it?
I think so. Most of the people who come to me with this question, usually they end up working on a topic that they are already expert in, right? So maybe this person used to be a fashion designer, right? And is like, I now see the problem. I want to contribute. What can I do, right? And there's only few cases in which it makes sense to choose a cause that you really have no expertise on. So my flow chart basically goes like, are you personally affected by this issue, right? So for example, if I was say, from the family of someone who was working in a sweatshop, I would be very well positioned to talk and work on this challenge, right? Or have you had firsthand expertise with this issue? So have you worked in the industry, for example? Or have you extensively studied it, right? Some people do long degrees and they really know about something, et cetera, et cetera. So what is your proximity to the challenge? And it's true that what you point out is that I think we ideally pick a cause that we have some proximity to, either like a legitimacy because we are part of the group, right? We are advocating on behalf of the issue from a place of I've experienced this myself, or we have really a lot of experience and expertise in it. If the person would not have any expertise, most likely I would work with them to find a challenge where they do have more proximity. And in few cases, it would make sense to say, okay, you know what, this is really your passion. Let's take the time to become an expert and to study this. Because if, we are saying we wouldn't want to be the people who import the Aga Toad again, right? Like we don't want to be the naive people who come in like, I'm going to solve this, and like not having any context, any knowledge, having not done that process to really understand the system. So when we do try to address systemic issues, we do want to be very mindful that anything we do will have an impact. And for example, if I act too quickly and I promise something and then I don't deliver on it, that community may not trust the next person who shows up and tries to work with them, right? So my actions have real consequences for the movement as a whole. And that's important to be mindful of, yeah. But not everyone is, wanting to go the way of systems change work, which is fine. Like a lot of what I do is not to say that everyone should do systems change work. Is like, well, if you feel called to do it and to address root causes, amazing. And here's how, and I want to help you. That's my work with Paraíba. But for everyone else, I kind of teach about systems thinking and also paradigm shifts in general as a way of looking at the world to avoid what I often see, which is people going into an issue, a challenge, trying to resolve it with the best of intentions and ending up reproducing the problem. Right. So we've recently heard a lot more about white saviorism, right, is one example where maybe I have good intentions and I want to help and I come at it with an attitude or bias that I haven't reflected on that actually cements the power imbalance if I'm not careful, right? And this is just one example. This can happen in all the fields that I have unintended consequences that happen as a result of my actions. So what I'm trying to do is like, no matter where you go to contribute, I encourage everyone to do some of that inner work of deconditioning ourselves, of reflecting on our biases, etc., and being mindful as we go into the field, as we go into the systems where we hope to intervene.
You've touched on it a little bit already, but what are the really wrong ways to go about this that people should be mindful of to try to catch themselves before doing it for too long?
So there's typical pitfalls in how we think and in how we act and in also in what we don't want to look at. And so in how we think, one of the pitfalls is just immediately thinking we have the solution, right? Like, problem, solution. And I would put this under linear thinking as a general kind of fallacy, but also sometimes ego-driven thinking, right? So as soon as we want to be the one who solves this issue, like my ego has taken such a space that actually, for example, collaborating with someone who shares the same goal becomes almost impossible because you're not my ally, you're my enemy because I want to be the one who solves, right? And this, I'm, caricaturizing a little bit, but this happens in many places in the movement, actually, right? Because we do compete sometimes for funding, for awards, etc. So in how we think, definitely watch out for linear thinking, watch out for the ego taking a lot of space, watch out for assumptions, especially when we are not part of the group that we are trying to support or to address with what we do. We make so many assumptions, right? It's like we can't really help ourselves. It's how we navigate the world. And so if we're not careful and if we don't make a conscious effort of working with the people that we are seeking to support. So say, for example, I don't know, I find out that there is, this many people who seek asylum currently living in Zurich. And I'm like, oh, these people are underserved. And I hear certain things. And if I just come at it, right, assuming what they need, and I design a project or an intervention based on what I assume they need, like I may already be way off, right? So these are some of the typical pitfalls and things I would be like, careful. Let's try not to do that. Or another one that I've already mentioned is trying to go too large scale, right? Like, oh, I care about the world. I want to solve global climate change, or let's end hunger on a global scale, or right, like these tendencies to go very big, which will end up either making me very depressed, maybe burned out, or just not very relevant because I stay in this theoretical space. So that's around the thinking piece. And then in how we act, it's kind of reflecting what I said before, but there needs to be a certain humility and openness to learning in how we act and how we show up. Because if I assume that I already had the answer and what I'm going to do is going to solve the problem, I'm just going to come in and do my thing. And I'm not going to be open for signals from the system. And actually, when we address systemic challenges and complex challenges, this is the only thing that we can really do. We can just try something and observe what happens, right? What is the feedback? What is the response? Does it work? Does it not work? How do the people we tried this with feel, etc. Right? So like we need this data, we need this information to be able to learn and then do our next step. So if I come at it with a 5-year linear plan and I just execute this plan for the next 5 years, like the chances that I'm really doing something relevant are fairly slim, because I'm not in conversation with the system, I'm not in conversation with the people, I'm not in touch with reality, I'm just executing. And this happens also more often than we think, because funding is allocated to projects for 5 years, and then you just got to pull through and tell your funder that you completed the project, right? Mm-hmm. So that's also for the funders to be more flexible and be more interested in what are we learning rather than just the KPIs that we had defined 5 years ago. The world has changed. Like we are not in the same place. I mean, yeah, the goddess knows, like it's 2025. 2020 was a different world, right? As was 2019. Yeah. So these are really two, I think, how we think, how we act, a lot of things that we need to be mindful of, I would say. And then also like, what are we avoiding? Because very often I find that people are uncomfortable when we start to talk about power and privilege and our own position in the system around those things. And understandably so, right? Like maybe in some other settings, they were made to feel very guilty or wrong for being, I don't know, white or a man or whatever. And it can be like, oh, like, I don't know what to say. Like, I don't know how to move in this space, right? It's uncomfortable. I'm afraid of being wrong, of not knowing what to do. And so the risk is that we just avoid it. We just don't touch the topic of power and privilege. And that's a huge pitfall, because kind of inherently in every systemic issue, one of the core problems is power distribution, right? Like we've been talking about who decides, who makes sure this doesn't change, who's invested in this remaining the same, etc. Those things are related to power. And what shows up out there always shows up in us too, and in our teams. And so trying to avoid the uncomfortable conversations around power and privilege can also lead us to either making mistakes or not fulfilling our potential, or replicating dynamics in our team that we actually don't want, right? So yeah, that's what comes to mind in terms of like things to be mindful of, or what's ideally not to do.
Mm. What is your view on the value of protesting? And I think let's take peaceful protesting in a country like Switzerland, for example, compared to more extreme cases in more extreme countries. Personally, I struggle to understand or see what the value could be. I understand why people do it, because again, it's like I'm angry and I want to act and I want people to hear, and it is a knee-jerk reaction to being upset at problems. But I do wonder if the issue that you're protesting isn't directly influenced or can be influenced by the country that you're in. And I don't want to go into the problem specifically, but I know like recently in the news, we've got protesting in Bern related to Palestine. And I wonder, what is the outcome that could be achieved by something like that? Do you think that that is a useful way to approach problems?
I see it as, depending on the context, a very valuable way to contribute. And the question is then, what is its purpose, right? Because is its purpose that we were here and we go all to the street and then suddenly we're there? No, right? Like its purpose is to raise awareness about this and to make visible to the people involved, like you are not alone in thinking that this needs to change, right? And this is very important because we saw this data come out that like something crazy, like 89% of people want drastic climate action, but kind of think that no one else wants it and that therefore it's not going to happen. And I'm like, this is crazy. Like we are almost 90% of people want this to change. And we were taught so much with these narratives and these stories and the money put into the propaganda machine that like it's impossible and we can never and human beings can't or whatever. Anyway, so going to a protest, I think, can also have this community building effect of making visible how many people actually disagree with something, disagree with a genocide or disagree with for example, right, a certain economic system, or disagree with poverty still existing, even though it doesn't have to. We would have all the resources we need, or hunger, right? So showing up to say, actually, I don't agree with this, even if my main contribution is elsewhere, can help, because in those numbers, there is power too, right? And if you think about the suffragettes and how they kind of, right, like got then eventually the right to vote, it was a lot of protesting. Like I saw this image of this one lady, and forgive me, sister, I forget her name, but she followed Churchill around with a bell. Every time he wanted to talk, she would ring a loud bell. Right? So there's all kinds of ways to protest, or like what we're seeing now coming out of Portland, right? That like people are, so Trump is invading the city, right? And people are putting on like frog costumes and like going, right, or dressing up as clowns and going to protest. Or I saw one where the protest was just people reading their newspaper, drinking coffee in their pajamas. And they were like, you can't disband us. We're just eating, like drinking coffee and reading the news, right? Anyway, I have a lot of appreciation. I've never been to Portland before, but the humor with which they come at these issues. Anyway, all this to say that I do think that protesting has a place. And then the question is really, what is the type of process, right? So do I condone or encourage violent protests and just destroying property for the sake of it, or seeking confrontation with the police, whilst we know that police brutality gets worse every time, right? Or steadily. No, I don't, right? This is not what I would propose personally as a strategy. But peaceful protest, maybe especially humorful protest, or protest that somehow kind of makes us realize what's going on. I think art can be a very effective way to do that, right? Sometimes you see a sculpture or you see a movie and suddenly you're like, oh, wow, like I didn't realize it was this bad, right? Like this person, for example, who wore their trash, all the trash that they produced for a week, they wore on their body. And it was like this massive bodysuit, right? It's like, oh, like I never thought, like, so different, right? Putting your thing in the trash versus seeing it literally as if you carried it with you. Anyway, so there's a space, in my opinion, for protesting. It can be a productive act. It can be an act that, you know, raises awareness about something, motivates more people to then act in different ways. But it's really important to, I think, understand that the protest itself is never the end goal, right? It's a step that we do. And if people get incredibly annoyed, for example, if protesters, you know, block a highway, it's always interesting to me that if the road, for example, gets flooded because of climate change, how many people are equally angry and upset at the people who, right, are kind of causing this. So sometimes there's also like a lot of anger targeted towards people who disrupt things, and but like climate change is going to disrupt all of our lives, right? And again, are you equally angry at the oil CEOs, for example, or right, whoever? So just some food for thought.
Beautifully said. Last question before we have to, unfortunately, end this conversation. Given you've been in this space for a while now, and I guess it really thinking about these big problems for a long time, giving all those talks. Are you optimistic about the future? Because at the moment, if I look at my phone, it's a very pessimistic outlook. So from someone who is much closer to the details than I am, are you optimistic about the future?
It's a hard question. So do I believe that, we will be able, with our existing institutions, really make it, right? So do I, for example, still have faith that the COP negotiations and all of these right instruments that we've developed are in themselves going to be sufficient for us to address our collective problems that we are facing? Not anymore, right? So I used to have a lot of faith in these global institutions and in all of that, having grown up also in Geneva, right? I almost went to work for the Swiss government in this or for the UN. So I used to think like, oh, like this is humanity coming together and it's like human rights for all. And then it turns out human rights only for some people, right? And the climate negotiations are hijacked by the lobbying of the status quo, etc. So I'm also, again, with all I'm saying, right, this is not blame. This is just how I see it and how I look at it. So I did go through a bit of a grieving process where I felt like the veils have been lifted, where I was like, wow, okay, I used to have all this hope, all this optimism. And I thought we had a pathway. Like I thought we knew how we were going to make it, how we were going to get there. And it was going to be through this collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. So this I had to grieve. But what I see now is that the way is not clear. And actually the way never was, right? So maybe it's a teaching in me learning on a more deeper level about complexity and systems thinking and systems change, right? That things are always evolving. Things are always like they're not permanent, right? So the problems are not permanent. The solutions or the institutions that we thought were going to be the solution are also not permanent and they're also not perfect. And the path to this future that we envision, that is regenerative, that is just, where people can be happy and live in harmony, etc. The path there has become less clear. And again, maybe it never was clear, right? But I had to give up my certainty when it comes to the path of how we were going to get there. Does it mean just because the path is no longer clear or has revealed itself not to be clear that I should give up, right? And for me, that was just never an option. Because if I give up in the sense of if I think, well, we're doomed anyway, there's nothing that I could possibly do. Who am I to change anything? Blah, blah, blah. Then I fall into really like a passivity and a powerlessness that, first of all, I don't want. Like, I don't want to feel like that, right? Like, I want to feel like there is meaning to my life and I can make a difference. And based on, research in psychology, like this is really important for people to feel like they have a purpose and it's not just all meaningless and we're not just, here cruising for no reason at all. So to me, it's really important that I feel like I am an active participant in this. And the knowledge that even if I do not know exactly how what I do right now will help kind of pave the way, right, towards this desired future, towards this vision, even if I do not live to see it, it is still worth doing, right? For the same reason that we were discussing before, that whether it's my hand that's burned right now, if I put my hand in the candle, or someone else's hand across the world, or, a child's hand 5 years in the future, maybe a descendant of mine, who knows, I still feel like I don't want to burn anyone's hand as much as I can, right? And equally, if I can contribute in any way towards their lives being more peaceful, more joyful, more harmonious, right? More abundant, more safe, then I want to do that. Like, I want to be a good ancestor, right? As much as I can. So I am hopeful for the reason that I am seeing how many are reaching this conclusion, that I am seeing that we are a movement, right? Millions of people strong across the world. Like, many of these people I will never meet, and still I feel a kinship to them because I know we are part of the same movement. And we may never talk, we may not even speak the same language, we may work on different topics, but I know that if they're, I don't know, working on the education system in India and I'm working on the textile industry in Switzerland, to go back to our example, like, we are working on interconnected issues. And even though we pull at different threads, we are both helping unravel the cloth and maybe creating a new one, right? Weaving a new future together. So I'm no longer optimistic in the maybe naive sense that I used to believe that there was this clear path that we just need to stick to and then we will make it. But I am hopeful and optimistic and very committed because I know there's nothing else I would rather do, right? Like I would rather be amongst those people who really try their best to make a difference. And even if it doesn't work out exactly the way we planned, even if we don't live to see the results, it will still have been a worthwhile thing to do. And there is no other way that I would rather spend my life. Like, as I said, I have no interest in just putting myself away in a bunker, right? And living in virtual reality or something. Like this is my life and this is what gives it meaning. And I know I'm not alone in feeling this way. And knowing that we are so many doing our best every day, whenever we can, to make a difference and to be aware of the impact that we all have and the power that we have, that's what keeps me hopeful.
Beautifully said. I can see why. I can imagine a lot of people look up to you. Inspirational stuff. Thank you very much, Nora. If people want to, we'll put a few with what you said, links in the show notes if people want to keep track. Is there anything else worth mentioning if people would like to learn more about your work? You're very easy to find on Google, but besides that, anything else worth mentioning if people want to check out your work or get involved?
Absolutely. So the work around finding your unique contribution, I have a program about that that's called the Change Work Compass. So that's available to anyone who's interested. There's a book that's going to come out hopefully sometime next year about that same topic. And in general, all my work around systems change can be found on Paraima. And then the other thing that we didn't talk about much, but this is also part of what I consider to be very important, is to be really honest about, also our struggles and the things that we're working on. And one of my struggles is to not burn out anymore. So I did have a burnout in 2022 and, was in recovery, etc. And as a recovering workaholic and someone who is in this system and wants to give so much, one of the things I have to watch out for is to not give too much of myself, right? And have these boundaries and take care of myself too, replenish my own inner well. And maybe some of the people listening are like that too, right? Like, especially for the givers of the world, it can be hard to put that care into yourself as well. So if those people are interested in that topic, there is another project that I have, a little side quest of mine called The Well Change Atelier, where we work more on that kind of inner level of resourcing ourselves, reconnecting, and we use a lot of creativity-based tools to do that. So yeah, those are my two main projects, and my DMs are open. I'm always happy to, hear feedback, what resonates with you, any follow-up questions. I'm very happy to be in conversation because, as I said, we're all in this together at the end of the day.
Well, given that you are a burnout recovery mode, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. You didn't have to do that. I really appreciate it. And all the best. Thank you very much, Nora.
Thank you so much. It's a few years out, but yeah, the journey never ends, right? Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.